Greetings, friends. I am Vitaly Portnikov. In an interview with the publication Kommersant, the head of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Sergey Lavrov, unexpectedly attacked the President of Kazakhstan, Kassym-Jomart Tokaev, recalling the Kazakh leader's speech at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum back in 2022. At that time, I remind you, the President of Kazakhstan, in the presence of the President of Russia, refused to recognize the sovereignty of the so-called Donbas People's Republics. And when asked about the right of nations to self-determination, he noted that if this right were fully realized, there would be dozens more states in the world than on its current political map. The fact that Lavrov recalled this speech by Tokayev 3 years later, and we fully understand that this is not an unexpected question from a journalist as such. Questions are interpreted, coordinated, and proposed by the Russian Foreign Policy Department itself, indicates how much Putin and his closest circle were irritated by Tokayev's response. Now, Lavrov clearly states that he disagrees with this position of the Kazakh president because the right to maintain territorial integrity and the right of a nation to self-determination are completely equal ideas in the Charter of the United Nations and modern international law. Such a statement by Lavrov can also be considered a signal to the leadership of Kazakhstan, a reminder that the Kremlin can at any moment use the card of the Russian population in the Republic of Kazakhstan to destabilize the situation in this country and even to occupy part of its territories if Kazakhstan does not follow in the wake of Russian policy. But from the perspective of characterizing the importance of a nation's right to self-determination as a justification for the Russian-Ukrainian war, Lavrov, as is usually the case with Russian officials and propagandists, of course, has flawed logic. After all, during the years of the war, Russia occupied part of Ukraine's territory with a predominantly Ukrainian ethnic population, thereby depriving the residents of the Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia regions of the right to self-determination, to live in a unified state with the rest of the Ukrainian people. In Crimea, occupied by Russia, Moscow, and before that St. Petersburg, consistently denies the right to national self-determination of the Crimean Tatar people who were a subject of statehood on the territory of the Crimean Peninsula long before any Russian settlers were ever heard of on this land. And when it comes to Russia itself, one can raise a whole host of questions. What about the national self-determination of the Tatar people? Why did Russia ignore the referendum on the independence of Tatarstan, in which the overwhelming majority of participants voted for the sovereignty and independence of the Republic of Tatarstan outside the borders of the Russian Federation? What about the national self-determination of the Chechen people, the overwhelming majority of whom expressed their desire for the independence of the Chechen Republic outside the territory of the Russian Federation? What ultimately be about the self-determination of the Tuvan people? When the decision to join the Tuvan Republic to the RSFSR and the Soviet Union was made without any referendums on the territory of Tuva by an unconstitutional decision of the small Kural of the Tuvan People's Republic alone. And no one at that time asked the Tuvans themselves or the parliament of Tuva about their desire and their national will. What about the self-determination of all the other peoples of Russia who are gradually becoming minorities in their own ethnic territories? Why is the occupation of a territory where the overwhelming majority of the population are ethnic Ukrainians and the detachment of this territory from the rest of Ukraine considered the realization of a nation's right to self-determination? And the residents of Tatars, Bashkirs, Chechens, Ingush, Kalmyks, Kabardians, Balkars, Yakuts. And this list can go on and on within a unified Russian state, without the possibility of national self-realization, and even with a ban on the mandatory study of these people's languages in their own territories of residence. Is this not a denial of a nation's right to self-determination? Why is it that in the case of Ukraine's occupation by the Kremlin, one approach is applied, but when it comes to the peoples of Russia, who have been oppressed by Moscow for centuries, a completely different approach is used? And this approach should be shared by the President of Kazakhstan, whose compatriots were able to realize their right to self-determination. Statehood was achieved only at the end of the 20th century, after centuries of national oppression and the transformation of the Kazakh people into a national minority on their own land, ignoring the Kazakh national and state history and the marginalization of the Kazakh language, even in the cities of the Kazakh SSR, let alone the entire Soviet Union, where, of course, there was no question of departments for studying Kazakh or disciplines for studying the history of Kazakhstan, not to mention imagining such a development of the situation. However, here, the Kazakhs and representatives of other peoples of the Soviet Union faced an entirely equal situation. In Russia, they ignored the very fact of the national identity of these peoples, did not want to learn their languages, were practically uninterested in their cultures, or turned the diversity of these cultures into a sort of culture of the peoples of the USSR, whose representatives were supposed to dance and perform in front of the big brother at exhibitions of national economic achievements in Moscow. Therefore, we perfectly understand what goals Lavrov is pursuing when he attacks Tokaev. This is not even an attack on the president of Kazakhstan. It is an attack on the Kazakhs, on Kazakh statehood, on Kazakh sovereignty as such. This once again shows contempt for this sovereignty and shows how Lavrov, this outsider who became a leading Russian chauvinist as another creator of chauvinistic Russia, Lenin, once accurately wrote about how he relates to the statehood of the peoples of the former Soviet Union. But I think the reaction to such statements will be opposite to the desire of the Kremlin's Ribbentrop. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel, subscribe to it, subscribe to my social networks, to the channels on Patreon, buy me a coffee, Donatello, which help develop these resources. Take advantage of the sponsorship opportunity right on YouTube. Peace to you.